He mocked his wife in front of the wrong man. The Mafia Kingpin claimed her with one look. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The crystal of the chandeliers overhead seemed to weep light, scattering fractured diamonds across the cavernous ballroom of the Grand Excelsior Hotel. Each reflection was a pinprick of cold fire in Lydia's vision, a starburst of anxiety that mirrored the splintering of her composure. She stood a half-step behind her husband, a position she had perfected over 6 years of marriage, close enough to be an accessory, but far enough to remain in his shadow. The emerald silk of her gown was a cool caress against her skin, a borrowed armor for a battle she was already losing. From this vantage point, she could see the tremor in her own hands, the slight, almost imperceptible vibration that had become a permanent resident in her body. Louis was at the podium, basking in the glow of the spotlights, his voice resonating with the false confidence of a man who had memorized his lines but never understood the script. He was charming the room, seducing investors for his new tech venture with a practiced blend of disruptive jargon and self-deprecating humor. Lydia knew the turn was coming. She could feel it in the air, a shift in barometric pressure just before the storm. "And of course," Louis said, his smile widening as he turned to gesture vaguely in her direction, "risk is a language my family understands. My beautiful wife, Lydia, for instance. A few years ago, she had a passion project, a lovely little art gallery downtown." He paused, letting the gentle, appreciative murmurs ripple through the crowd of tailored suits and glittering jewels. Lydia's stomach hollowed out. She poured her heart into it. "And I, being the supportive husband, poured a considerable amount of capital into it." He laughed, a short, sharp sound that was all performance. "Let's just say my return on investment was purely emotional. The gallery, bless her heart, was a financial black hole, a very pretty, very expensive hobby." The room fell into a breathtaking silence. It was not a polite silence. It was the thick, uncomfortable quiet of a shared cringe, of 100 people witnessing a public evisceration and not knowing where to look. Lydia felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a painful flush that she was certain was visible even from the back of the room. He had taken her dream, the one thing that had been hers, and reduced it to a punchline to impress men with fatter wallets and smaller souls. The tremor in her hands intensified, a violent shudder now, and she clasped them together, digging her nails into her own palms to anchor herself to the moment. From the edge of the room, a low voice cut through the stillness, as calm and sharp as shearing ice. "I disagree with your assessment of the investment." All heads turned. Silly's Tribbiani stepped from the shadows near the bar, a specter of immense power in a charcoal three-piece suit that seemed molded to his broad shoulders. He moved with an unnerving economy of motion, each step silent and deliberate. His close-cropped dark hair and trimmed stubble were severe, his cool gray eyes analytical as they swept over Louis, dismissing him in an instant before landing on Lydia. In his gaze, there was no pity, only a startlingly direct assessment. "A passion project that fails is not a wasted investment," Sillies continued, his voice never rising but somehow commanding the entire space. "It is the cost of tuition for learning what the market does not want. A lesson, I'd wager, is more valuable than the seed money for another redundant data mining algorithm." The insult was delivered so placidly it took a moment to register, but when it did, a fresh wave of whispers broke across the room. Louis's smug smile faltered, his face paling under the hot lights. He was a minnow who had just been addressed by a shark. Sillies' attention remained fixed on Lydia. He saw the classic beauty, the poised elegance that was cracking at the seams. He saw the emerald gown and the delicate diamonds. But he also saw the tremor, the faint sheen of sweat on her upper lip, the ghost of 1,000 similar humiliations in the depths of her eyes. It was a vulnerability he recognized, the kind that predators like her husband exploited and men like him either protected or consumed. He made a decision. He turned his gaze to the silent auction table, where a rather unremarkable abstract painting, the one Lydia had donated from her gallery's final, unsold stock, was on display. "I'll take the painting," Sillies announced to the harried event organizer. $250,000. A collective gasp went through the room. The piece was valued at $10,000 at best. It was not a purchase, it was a statement. A declaration of power so immense that $250,000 was disposable punctuation. Louis was speechless, his mouth opening and closing silently. Having concluded his business, Sillies moved through the parted crowd until he stood before Lydia. He was taller than she had realized, a mountain of quiet menace and unshakable calm. The faint, silvery line of a scar traced his jaw, a hint of battles fought far from any ballroom. "That man," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her, his eyes never leaving hers, "does not deserve to breathe the same air as the art you champion." He extended a hand, not to touch her, but as an offering. "I am presenting you with a different deal, Mrs. Fletcher. A better one. Walk away from him. Right now, come with me." Lydia stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room, the whispers, the suffocating weight of her life with Louis all faded into a dull roar. All she could see were his gray eyes, steady and absolute. "Why?" she managed to whisper, the word catching in her throat. "Because I detest bullies," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious reason in the world. "And because I believe your portfolio is undervalued." He offered her a deal not of marriage or romance, but of sanctuary, a business proposition. "Leave the man who breaks you," he said, his voice dropping lower, a velvet growl of promise, "and I will make you untouchable." It was an insane, impossible choice. To walk away from her life, her home, everything she knew, with a man who was a legend, a myth, a monster to some. But as she looked from Sillies' unwavering gaze to the sputtering, humiliated face of her husband, she knew it was no choice at all. It was an escape. With a final, deep breath that tasted of freedom and terror, Lydia took a step forward, away from Louis's shadow and into the orbit of Sillies' tribune. The tremor in her hands did not stop, but for the first time in years, it felt less like fear and more like the beginning of a powerful, earth-shattering quake. The ride from the gala was a silent, surreal journey through a city that glittered like a web of spilled diamonds. Lydia sat on the supple leather of the Rolls-Royce's back seat, the scent of expensive upholstery and Sillies' subtle, clean cologne filling the air. She watched the neon-drenched streets slide by, feeling utterly disconnected from the woman who had walked into that hotel hours earlier. That woman had been an appendage, an accessory. This woman, the one sitting beside the most powerful and feared man in the city, felt like a ghost, untethered and terrified. When the car slid to a halt in a private underground garage, she followed him numbly into a private elevator that ascended with a silent, stomach-dropping speed. The doors opened directly into his penthouse. It was less a home and more a statement of absolute dominion. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides presented a breathtaking, panoramic view of the skyline. The space was vast, decorated in shades of charcoal, slate, and steel, with minimalist furniture that looked both impossibly expensive and brutally uncomfortable. There was no clutter, no personal touch, only power and precision. It was the lair of a predator at the apex of his food chain. Sillies gestured toward a sitting area. "Sit, drink," he asked, his tone still that of a man conducting a business meeting. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter without waiting for her answer, handing one to her. The glass was heavy in her hand. "What happens now?" Lydia asked, her voice small in the cavernous room. He took a seat opposite her, the city lights framing his formidable silhouette. "Now we define the terms of our arrangement," he said calmly. "Your husband, Louis, is attempting to secure Series B funding for his new company, a venture that, if successful, would interfere with one of my own logistics networks. His primary targets for investment were in that room tonight. By publicly humiliating him and claiming you, I have sown doubt. Capital is timid. It does not invest in instability or scandal. Your leaving him in such a spectacular fashion makes him look weak, volatile, and foolish. That is my benefit." He paused, letting the cold calculus of his actions settle. "Your benefit is more straightforward. I will provide you with a residence, security, and a financial stipend. My legal team will handle the divorce. They are thorough. You will be free of him, and he will be unable to touch you or any assets you are entitled to. In return, you will be seen with me publicly on occasion. Dinners, events, it will reinforce the narrative of his loss and my acquisition." Lydia bristled at the word. "I am not a company to be acquired, Mr. Tribune." A flicker of something, perhaps respect, passed through his cool gray eyes. "No, you are not," he conceded. "You are an ally in a strategic partnership, but you must understand the world you have just stepped into. Perception is reality. To the outside, you are my mistress, my prize, the woman I took from a lesser man. The truth of our arrangement is irrelevant. Its public power is what matters. She looked down at the untouched drink in her hands, her mind reeling. She had fled one cage, a gilded cage of emotional abuse and belittling control, only to be offered another, this one made of steel and glass and cold, hard pragmatism. She felt a surge of resistance, a desperate need to assert the independence she had not felt in years. "I can't do that," she said, shaking her head. "I can't just be a prop in your corporate games. I need to work. I need to have my own life." Sillies watched her, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be weighing her, measuring her resolve. "Independence is not given, Lydia. It is taken," he said, his voice softer now. "I am not offering you a cage. I am offering you a fortress from which you can rebuild. What you do within its walls is up to you. You want to work. My organization has a charitable foundation. It acquires art for public institutions. It could use a discerning eye." The offer hung in the air, a lifeline she hadn't expected. It was more than Lewis had ever offered her. It was a recognition of her skills, not just her beauty. The temptation was a slow, creeping warmth, a stark contrast to the cold fear that had been her constant companion. She was still terrified of him, of the silent, coiled power he emanated, but she was also drawn to it. His control wasn't frantic and insecure like Lewis's. It was absolute, a gravity well that bent the world to his will. The thought of being protected by that gravity, rather than crushed by it, was intoxicating. Their first public outing was 3 nights later, at a restaurant so exclusive it had no sign. The moment they stepped from the car, flashes from lurking paparazzi erupted like magnesium flares. Sillies placed a steadying hand on the small of her back, a simple gesture of possession that sent a jolt of electricity through her. Inside, a hush fell over the dining room. Every eye was on them. She could feel their stares, their whispers dissecting her, judging her, inventing stories. But with Sillies at her side, the scrutiny felt different. It was not the shamming judgment she had endured with Lewis, but a kind of fearful awe. They were not looking at Lydia Fletcher, the failed gallery owner. They were looking at the woman who belonged to Sillies Tribbiani. As he guided her to their table, his presence was a shield, deflecting the curiosity and envy of the entire room. He spoke to her throughout dinner, asking quiet questions about art, about her education, about the things she had loved before Lewis had taught her to make herself small. He listened with an unnerving intensity, as if her answers were data points he was committing to memory. The chemistry between them was no longer manufactured. It was a low hum beneath the surface of their conversation, a dangerous current pulling them closer. She found herself watching the way he moved, the way his long fingers held his wine glass, the way his gray eyes would occasionally darken when he looked at her. She was supposed to be acting, playing a part. But as the night wore on, she began to fear that the only person she was deceiving was herself. She was resisting, but she was also succumbing to the allure of his world, to the temptation of the man who had claimed her with a single look. The backlash from Lewis was as swift as it was pathetic. He was a man stripped of his power, and like a cornered animal, he lashed out wildly. Tabloid headlines screamed with fabricated stories he had sold them. Jilted husband betrayed by scheming wife and corporate raider. And inside the affair that wrecked a marriage. He painted Lydia as a gold-digging adulteress and Sillies as a predatory monster. He even tried to freeze their joint accounts, a futile gesture that Sillies' legal team reversed with a single phone call. The smear campaign was a nuisance, a swarm of gnats in the face of Sillies' granite composure, but it was the public confrontation that crossed a line. Lydia had been leaving a couture showroom where Sillies had insisted she acquire a new wardrobe. Armor for the coming battles, he had called it, when Lewis appeared, materializing from behind a parked car like a wraith. His face was blotchy, his expensive suit rumpled. He smelled of whiskey and desperation. "Lydia, you can't do this," he hissed, grabbing her arm. "You're my wife, you belong with me." His grip was surprisingly strong, his eyes wild with a fury she had not seen since the early days of their marriage. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Before she could scream, 2 men in dark suits appeared as if from thin air. They were Sillies' security detail, ever present but always unseen. They removed Lewis's hand from her arm with a calm, brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. "Mr. Fletcher," one of them said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion, "Mr. Tribbiani has instructed us to ensure you maintain a minimum distance of 500 feet from his associate." That night, the incident was not mentioned, but Lydia could feel a change in the air, a sharpening of the edges in her new reality. She knew that Sillies would handle it, but she did not know what that meant. A few days later, he asked her to accompany him on a late-night drive. They did not take the Rolls-Royce, but a black, unassuming sedan that blended into the city's shadows. The driver took them to the industrial waterfront, a place of groaning cranes, rusting freighters, and the salty, damp smell of the harbor. He led her to the end of a long, dimly lit pier, where another man was waiting for them. He was older, with a weathered face and hands like gnarled oak. This was not a boardroom meeting. This was something else entirely. Sillies introduced the man as Rico, his second in command, and for the next 20 minutes, Lydia stood in the shadows and listened as they spoke in low tones about shipping manifests, union disputes, and a rival family, the Vescovis, who were getting too ambitious. She heard words like containment and leverage and a permanent solution. It was all spoken in the dispassionate language of business, but the undercurrent of violence was unmistakable. She understood then that his empire was not just built on stocks and acquisitions. It was built on a foundation of fear and absolute loyalty, cemented by the kind of power that did not bother with courts or contracts. The sight both horrified her and, to her shame, made her feel profoundly safe. The man who wielded this terrifying power was the same one who had shielded her from public humiliation, the same one who listened with rapt attention when she spoke of impressionist painters. He was a paradox of ruthless control and quiet tenderness, and she was falling for him completely. Later, back in the silent sanctuary of the penthouse, the city lights a distant, silent witness, she found the courage to ask. "The scar," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She reached out, her fingers hesitating an inch from his jaw. "How did you get it?" He did not flinch from her near touch. His gray eyes clouded over with a memory that was clearly painful. He was silent for a long moment, and she thought he would not answer. "It was a gift," he finally said, his voice rough. "From my uncle. He was my father's right hand, the man who was supposed to protect me after my father died. Instead, he saw an opportunity. He tried to sell our family's territory to a rival, with me as part of the bargain." He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the dark skyline. "I was 17. He held the knife to my throat and told me that loyalty was a currency for fools. He made a mistake. He talked too much." Sillies finally met her eyes again, and in their depths she saw the ghost of the boy he had been, a boy forced to become a king overnight. "He taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Trust is not given. It is earned, and betrayal is not forgiven. It is excised." He finally closed the small distance between them and captured her hand, pressing her palm gently against the faint, silvery line of the scar. His skin was warm. In that moment, he was not a kingpin or a CEO. He was a man with a wound, and in his vulnerability, she saw a reflection of her own. She had been betrayed by the man who was supposed to love her. He had been betrayed by the man who was supposed to protect him. They were two sides of the same tarnished coin, and the chasm of fear and uncertainty that had separated them finally, irrevocably, closed. The transition from a business arrangement to a genuine romance was as seamless as it was terrifying. It happened in stolen moments. A shared look across a crowded room that felt more intimate than a touch. A quiet conversation late at night when the city slept below them. The way he would place a hand on her back. A gesture that was no longer for show but a genuine, grounding comfort. The business retreat at a sprawling country estate in the Hudson Valley was supposed to be a strategic weekend. A gathering of Sillies' key lieutenants to plan their next move against the encroaching Vescovi family. For Lydia, it was the first time she had been away from the city since her life had been upended, and the crisp autumn air and fiery colors of the changing leaves felt like a cleansing breath. But the peace was a fragile illusion. The estate, for all its rustic beauty, was a fortress, with security personnel moving discreetly along the perimeter. The danger they were planning against was not an abstract concept. It was a palpable threat. The ambush came on the second night. They were walking along a wooded path after dinner, the moonlight filtering through the nearly bare branches of the trees. The attack was swift and professional. 2 cars without headlights blocked the path ahead and behind, and men in dark gear emerged, weapons raised. Sillies' reaction was instantaneous and primal. He shoved Lydia behind him, shielding her with his body as his own men materialized from the surrounding woods. The night erupted in a terrifying cacophony of shouts and the sickening, soft thuds of body blows. It was over in less than a minute. Silly's was untouched, but his fury was a cold, silent inferno. One of the attackers, his face bloody and broken, was dragged before him. Silly's crouched, his voice a lethal whisper. "Who sent you?" The man spat blood. "Vescovi sends his regards. He said to tell you he has a new partner, a man named Louis Fletcher. Said you took something of his, and he's helping Vescovi take something of yours." Lydia's blood ran cold. Louis. Pathetic, humiliated Louis had allied himself with a monster, escalating his petty revenge into a potential bloodbath, with her as the prize. In the aftermath, back inside the heavy oak doors of the main house, the pretense between them was stripped away. The adrenaline of the attack and the stark reality of her entanglement in his violent world left no room for ambiguity. He stood before the massive stone fireplace, the flames dancing in his dark eyes. "This is my fault," he said, his voice raw. "I brought you into this. I put a target on your back." Lydia walked towards him, her fear eclipsed by a fierce, undeniable certainty. "I chose to walk away with you, sillies," she said, her voice steady. "I chose this. I choose you." She reached up and touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw, the scar that was no longer a mystery to her. The dam of his control finally broke. He pulled her against him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was not gentle or tender but desperate and claiming, a raw expression of fear and possession, and a love that had grown in the most dangerous of soils. It was a confession, a surrender, a promise made in the shadow of death. The next morning, the dynamic had shifted entirely. He was no longer just her protector, she was no longer just his ward. They were partners. He took her to his study, a room lined with books that were not for show, and laid out the blueprints of his legitimate empire. "You said you wanted to work," he said, his tone serious. "I wasn't being flippant. The Tribuni Foundation manages 3 museums and a dozen public art programs. It is currently being run by a board of stuffy old men who care more about tax write-offs than cultural impact. I want you to run it, not as a figurehead, as its president. You will have full autonomy, your own budget, your own staff. It will be yours." It was an offer of breathtaking trust and respect. He was not just giving her a distraction, he was giving her a dominion, a corner of his empire to command as her own. But she understood the price of this promise. To accept this role, to accept him, was to accept the constant, looming threat of men like Vescovi. It meant living a life where a walk in the woods could turn into a violent ambush, where her name would forever be linked to his, a name whispered with fear and reverence in the city's underworld. Her safety, her future, her very identity would be forged in the crucible of his dangerous world. As she looked into his eyes, she saw the question he was not asking. Was she willing to pay that price? Her old life of quiet desperation with Louis seemed a pale, bloodless memory. This new life was terrifying, but it was also vibrant and real. For the first time, she felt truly alive. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I accept." The final act played out in a place of beautiful decay. An abandoned art museum, its marble halls echoing and its frescoed ceilings peeling, temporarily resurrected to host a black market auction. Marco Vescovi, Sillies' chief rival, was liquidating assets from a recently acquired shipping company in a bold display of power. It was a gathering of the city's shadow elite, a room full of men who traded in secrets and fear. Sillies knew Vescovi would be auctioning off something more than just cargo containers. He would be selling leverage. And seated at Vescovi's right hand, looking pale and smugly triumphant, was Louis. He was Vescovi's trophy, the jilted husband, a living symbol of a supposed weakness in the Tribuni Empire. Lydia stood by Sillies' side, wearing a gown of midnight blue that was both elegant and severe. She was not the trembling woman from the charity gala. Her posture was erect, her gaze steady. She had spent the last few weeks immersing herself in the foundation, proving to be a shrewd and decisive leader, earning the respect of the board and the quiet pride of the man beside her. She had found her strength, not in his shadow, but illuminated by his trust. The climax of the auction was a single, unassuming ledger. Vescovi presented it with a flourish. "This book," he announced, his voice oily, "contains shipping routes, payment records, the full logistical backbone of a very profitable, very discreet enterprise. An enterprise, I am told, that a certain esteemed guest in this room might find familiar." It was a direct challenge, a public attempt to expose and cripple Sillies' operations. The bidding was fierce, but it was a pantomime. This was a duel between two kings. As the price climbed into the tens of millions, Louis, emboldened by his proximity to power, saw his moment. He stood up and pointed a trembling finger at Lydia. "And what about her?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "The whore he bought, ask her what she knows. She was my wife, she knows things." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Lydia. It was the gala all over again, the spotlight, the accusation, the public humiliation. But this time she did not flinch. She met Louis's desperate, hateful gaze with a look of pure, cold pity. Before Cillies could utter a single, deadly command, Lydia stepped forward. "You are right about one thing, Louis," she said, her voice clear and carrying through the cavernous space. "I was your wife. I was the woman whose dreams you mocked to impress investors. I was the woman you tried to break to make yourself feel like a man." She took another step, her eyes sweeping over the room, meeting the gazes of the powerful men watching her. "But you failed. You did not break me. You freed me. The man I am with now did not buy me. He saw value in something you deemed worthless. He offered me respect. He gave me power. You see me as a possession that was stolen. He sees me as a partner. Your mistake was never in losing me. It was in thinking you ever owned me in the first place." A stunned silence followed her words. She had not defended herself as a victim. She had declared herself a queen. Louis stood, utterly defeated, his last pathetic gambit having crumbled to dust. Cillies looked at her, and in his eyes was a depth of love and admiration that was more profound than any public vow. He turned his attention back to the auctioneer. 100 million, he said calmly, a price so astronomically high it was designed not just to win, but to annihilate. Vescovi, his face ashen, could not counter. He was ruined. With a slight nod from Cillies, two of his men moved silently through the crowd and escorted a babbling, broken Louis from the room. He would not be a problem for anyone, ever again. Cillies had won, not with a gun, but with a checkbook and the unshakable strength of the woman by his side. The aftermath found them on his garden terrace as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gray. The city below was still quiet, a sleeping beast. The air was cool and clean, smelling of citrus from the potted trees and rich, dark coffee from the 2 cups cooling on the small table between them. The violence and tension of the night before felt a world away. "You were magnificent," Cillies said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet morning. He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I did what you taught me," she replied, her voice soft. "I took my independence." He shook his head slightly. "No, that was always inside you. I just opened the door to the cage." They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sun climb higher, burning away the shadows from the streets below. "This world," she said finally, "the danger, it will never really go away, will it?" "No," he answered honestly. "But it can be managed, reshaped. I am delegating more of the family business to Rico. My focus is on our legitimate enterprises, on the foundation, on you." It was not a promise to change who he was. He would always be a kingpin, a man with scars and secrets. But it was a promise to build a different kind of kingdom, a shared one, fortified not just by power and fear, but by love and loyalty. He was reshaping his empire to protect his queen. She squeezed his hand, a silent acceptance of it all, the danger, the power, the complicated, ruthless man she loved. As the city below slowly woke to a new day, Lydia felt no fear, only a quiet, profound sense of peace. She was home.